The rain did not fall. It assaulted. For 3 days, the Arizona territory had been under siege by a sky the color of a fresh bruise, a relentless deluge that turned the red earth into a thick, clinging mire. The wind, a mournful beast, howled through the canyons and tore at the sparse pines that dotted the landscape, their branches clawing at the heavens in a desperate ballet. In the heart of this elemental chaos, nestled against the foot of a stony mesa and surrounded by a thicket of unforgiving forest, stood a small cabin. It was a lonely, defiant thing, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and hope, its windows like vacant eyes staring into the storm. Smoke, pale and ghostly, curled from its stone chimney, the only sign of life for 50 miles in any direction. This was Clara's world, a world shrunk to the size of a one-room cabin, a chicken coop, and a small garden patch that was currently drowning. It had been 2 years since Elias was buried, 2 years since a stray bullet in a skirmish between the local militia and a band of Apache raiders had made her a widow at 26. He had been a good man, a dreamer with calloused hands and a quiet smile, who had promised her a life carved from the wilderness. Instead, the wilderness had carved him out of her life, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any storm. The townsfolk in Prescott, a 2-day ride east, thought her peculiar, perhaps mad. For staying? A lone woman. They'd mutter over their whiskey and dry goods. It ain't right, but leaving would have been a betrayal of the life they had started. And more than that, Clara had found a strange, bitter solace in her isolation. The grief had scoured her soul, leaving behind a hard, smooth surface. She had become as resilient and unyielding as the land itself. Her heart, once a warm and trusting thing, was now a locked room, the key long lost. She survived. Her chickens, a flock of hardy, speckled hens, provided eggs. Her garden in the dry months gave her vegetables. She was a skilled seamstress, and her hands, once soft, were now deft and strong, capable of mending a torn shirt or setting a splint with equal proficiency. Once a month, she would load her mule, Beatrice, and make the journey to town to sell her wares and buy the necessities: flour, salt, kerosene. She spoke little, her face a carefully composed mask that discouraged questions and offered no invitations. She was the widow on the edge of the Apache lands, a ghost story whispered by children, a cautionary tale for the wives. Tonight, the wind was a particularly vicious marauder, rattling the door in its frame and sending drafts of icy air through the smallest cracks in the walls. Clara sat by the hearth, the firelight casting dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel both smaller and infinitely vast. She was darning a sock, her needle moving with a practiced, rhythmic precision. Each stitch was a tiny act of order against the chaos raging outside. The rhythmic clatter of the rain on the tin roof was a familiar lullaby, a sound that usually brought a sense of security, of being sheltered and safe. But then came a different sound. It was not the wind. It was not a falling branch. It was a heavy, wet thud against her door, followed by a scraping noise, like a great weight slumping down the wood. Clara froze, her needle poised in midair. Her heart, a dormant, sluggish thing, gave a painful lurch. No one ever came to her door, no one. A trapper might pass by once a season, a prospector chasing rumors of gold, but never in a storm like this, and never at night. Her first thought was of a panther, or perhaps a bear, driven down from the high country by the weather. She reached for the heavy iron poker resting by the fire, its weight a cold, solid comfort in her hand. Another sound, a low groan, filtered through the wood. It was human. Her blood ran cold. The militia didn't patrol this far out, and any traveler with sense would have hunkered down long before the storm hit its peak. That left only one possibility, a possibility that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Slowly, silently, she rose. She crept to the door, the floorboards groaning softly under her weight. With the poker held tight in one hand, she used the other to slide the heavy bolt. It scraped back with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud over the roar of the wind and rain. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the heavy door inward. Just a crack, peering into the maelstrom. At first, she saw nothing but the churning darkness and the silver sheets of rain. Then she looked down. Sprawled on her porch, half submerged in a growing puddle of rainwater and mud, was a man. But he was unlike any man she had ever seen up close. He was a giant, his frame so large it seemed to consume the entire porch. His skin, a deep, rich copper, was slick with rain and something darker. His hair, long and black as a raven's wing, was matted with mud and blood. He was naked from the waist up, and his broad chest and torso were a horrifying canvas of injury. A deep gash ran from his shoulder down his side, weeping blood that mingled with the rain, staining the wooden planks a sickening crimson. He was Apache. The poker fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering onto the floor. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door, to bolt it, to pile the furniture against it and pray he bled to death before he could gain the strength to break it down. An Apache. The word itself was a curse in her mind, a name inextricably linked with the death of her husband, with the fear that was a constant, low hum in the lives of every settler in this territory. They were savages, murderers, the faceless enemy in the stories told around campfires and in the saloons. He stirred, his head lifting a bare inch from the boards. His eyes, dark pools of agony, found hers. She could see the incredible effort it took for him to focus, to form words. His lips, cracked and bloodless, parted. A voice, barely a whisper, a rough, guttural sound torn from the depths of his being, reached her over the storm. "Please, heal me." And then, as if that final plea had expended the last of his strength, his head fell back and his massive body went still. He collapsed completely, a mountain of wounded flesh at her feet. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, the wind and rain whipping at her dress, plastering the cold, wet fabric to her skin. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and revulsion. "Let him die," a voice inside her hissed, cold and venomous. "He's one of them. He would have killed Elias without a second thought. He would kill you. Slam the door. Let the storm take him." It was the voice of reason, the voice of survival. He was the enemy. To help him was to invite death, not just from him, but from her own people. If the townsfolk ever found out she had sheltered an Apache warrior, they would burn her cabin to the ground with her inside it. She took a step back, her hand reaching for the edge of the door. Her knuckles were white. It would be so easy. A simple push, the slide of a bolt, and the problem would be gone. He would be just another casualty of this brutal land. But then something else stirred within her, an instinct buried deep beneath the layers of grief and fear. Before she was a widow, before she was a settler, Clara had been a nurse in St. Louis before following Elias west. She had worked in a hospital, tending to the sick and the broken. She had seen wounds like this before, and worse. She knew the sickly sweet smell of infection, the pale clamminess of a man bleeding out, the shallow rasp of lungs struggling for air. Her hands, seemingly of their own accord, clenched and unclenched. They remembered the feel of bandages, the pull of a needle through skin, the firm pressure needed to stanch a flow of blood. She looked at the man again. He was no longer just an Apache. He was a patient, a human being, bleeding to death on her porch. Her training, her ingrained code of healing, rose up like a rebellion against her fear. To let a man die when she had the skill to save him, it felt like a sin more profound than any other. It was a betrayal of a part of herself she thought had died with Elias. "Damn you," she whispered, the words snatched away by the wind. "Damn you to hell." The decision was not made in her head, but in her body. With a surge of desperate resolve, she moved. The man was impossibly heavy. She grabbed him under the arms, her boots slipping in the mud and blood. She strained, her muscles screaming in protest, and dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, across the threshold and into the relative warmth of the cabin. His body left a thick, dark smear across her floor. With a final, lung-searing heave, she got him fully inside and slammed the door shut, ramming the bolt home. For a moment, she leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs. The storm outside seemed muted now, its fury less immediate than the crisis lying on her floor. The man was unconscious, his breathing shallow. The gash on his side was long and deep, likely from a knife. But there was also a puckered, angry-looking wound on his shoulder. A bullet hole. It was a miracle he had made it this far. Shaking, she forced herself into motion. Her nursing instincts took over completely, pushing aside the fear and the doubt. She stoked the fire, adding logs until it roared to life, casting a warm, flickering glow over the grim scene. She fetched her medical supplies, a small wooden box containing clean linen for bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid, needles, and catgut sutures. She filled a basin with water and set it on the hearth to warm. She worked through the night, a solitary figure in the pool of firelight, the storm her only companion. First, she had to cut away the tattered remnants of his buckskin leggings. As she worked, she got her first true look at him. He was built on a scale that was almost inhuman. His shoulders were broad and powerful, his arms corded with muscle, his legs long and thick. This was a man made for battle, for survival in a harsh world, and his body was a roadmap of that life. As she gently cleaned the mud and blood from his skin, the light from the fire revealed a network of old scars. A thin, silvery line ran across his collarbone. A puckered, star-shaped mark was nestled in the muscles of his thigh. A jagged, faded scar disappeared under his arm. These were not the marks of an ordinary life. These were the archives of violence, of battles fought and won, or at least survived. Each scar told a story she could only guess at, a testament to a life lived on the knife's edge. He was a warrior, a veteran of countless brutal encounters. The thought sent a fresh tremor of fear through her. What kind of man had she brought into her home? She focused on the task at hand. The bullet in his shoulder was lodged deep. Probing for it was a delicate, gruesome business. He groaned in his unconsciousness, his body twitching. But he did not wake. Her touch was sure and steady as she located the lead ball and, with a grimace, extracted it. Then came the stitching, both for the bullet wound and the long, gaping knife wound in his side. Her needle moved with an old, familiar rhythm, pulling the torn flesh together, closing the breach, imposing order on the chaos of the injury. She worked tirelessly, her face set in a mask of concentration. Her entire world narrowed to the point of her needle and the body of the man under her hands. Finally, after hours that bled into one another, she was done. He was bandaged tightly, his wounds cleaned and dressed. She had covered him with a heavy wool blanket. The bleeding had stopped. His breathing, though still shallow, was more regular. He would live, at least for now. Exhausted, Clara sank onto the small stool by the fire, her body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. Her dress was stiff with dried blood. Her hands trembled from the strain. In the flickering firelight, she looked at the man she had saved. The light softened the hard lines of his face, the sharp cheekbones, the strong jaw. For all the brutality etched onto his body, his face in sleep was startlingly peaceful. There was no menace there, no savagery. There was only a profound, almost childlike stillness. A strange and unwelcome feeling stirred in her chest, a flicker of something that felt dangerously like compassion. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. She had an Apache warrior, a man who was likely a fugitive, lying wounded in her home. The dawn would come in a few hours, and with it, the possibility of discovery. She couldn't keep him here. In the main room, it was too risky. Her eyes fell on the heavy plank door at the back of the cabin. It led to a small, hidden room, little more than a large pantry dug into the hillside behind the house, where she stored preserves and dried goods. It was cool, dark, and, most importantly, concealed. No one in town even knew it existed. With renewed, fear-fueled energy, she got to her feet. She managed to rouse him enough to make him help, half guiding, half dragging him into the back room. She settled him on a pile of old burlap sacks and blankets, making a crude bed. He was barely conscious, mumbling something in a language she didn't understand before lapsing back into a deep, healing sleep. Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the hidden man, the weight of her secret pressed down on her, suffocating her. She had crossed a line by saving him. She had bound her fate to his by hiding him. She had declared war on the world she knew. She closed the heavy door, plunging him into darkness, and slid a wooden chest in front of it, hoping it would look innocuous. Returning to the main room, she scrubbed the blood from the floorboards until her knuckles were raw, trying to erase any trace of what had happened. But she knew it was a futile effort. She could clean the floor, but she could not cleanse her conscience or escape the danger that now slept soundly behind her pantry door. The storm outside was beginning to subside, but Clara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the soul, that the real storm was just beginning. The morning after the storm broke with a deceptive fragility, as if the world itself was bruised and tender. A watery sun filtered through the ragged clouds, casting a pale, apologetic light on a landscape scoured clean. The air was sharp and cold, thick with the scent of damp earth and shattered pine. For Clara, the quiet was more jarring than the tempest had been. It was a silence filled with the heavy presence of the man hidden in her larder. She needed herbs for a poultice, yarrow to stave off fever, comfrey to knit the flesh. Her own small supply had been exhausted in the night's frantic work. This meant a trip to Prescott, a journey she dreaded on the best of days, but which today felt like a walk into a lion's den. Every moment away from the cabin would be an agony of suspense, every interaction in town a potential betrayal. But the man's life depended on it. His breathing was still labored, and a fever was beginning to bloom on his skin, a dry, dangerous heat. Before leaving, she checked on him. In the sliver of light from the open door, he lay still, a formidable shape under the thin blanket. She placed a jar of water and a piece of hardtack beside him, though she doubted he had the strength for either. "I'll be back before nightfall," she whispered to the still form, the words feeling foolish and inadequate. She was speaking to an unconscious enemy, making a promise she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. The ride to Prescott was a treacherous slog through a world remade of mud. The trail had been washed out in places, forcing her and Beatrice through sucking bogs that threatened to pull the mule down. When she finally saw the cluster of wooden buildings that constituted the town, her stomach tightened into a cold knot. Prescott was abuzz with the storm's aftermath. Men were clearing a fallen cottonwood from the main street, their shouts echoing in the clear air. Women swept mud from their porches, their faces grim. As Clara tied Beatrice to the hitching post outside Abernathy's general store, she felt the familiar shift in the atmosphere. Conversations faltered, heads turned, eyes followed her, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and a distinct, chilling disapproval. She was the woman who lived alone, the woman who had not been broken by grief but hardened by it, and they neither understood nor trusted this transformation. The bell above the store's door announced her arrival with a cheerful jangle that was entirely at odds with the reception she received. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face was a permanent mask of dour judgment, stopped polishing the counter and watched her approach. "Clara," he said, his voice flat. It was not a greeting, but an acknowledgement, like noting a change in the weather. "Silas," she replied, her own voice just as devoid of warmth. "I need supplies, yarrow and comfrey root. if you have them, and a bottle of whiskey. His eyebrows, bushy and gray, rose a fraction. Whiskey? Didn't figure you for a drinker, living out there all alone. The insinuation was clear, hanging in the air thick as dust motes. A lone woman buying whiskey could only mean one of two things. She was drowning her sorrows, or she wasn't alone. It's for medicinal purposes, she said, her voice sharp. She refused to be baited, refused to show any crack in her composure. Of course, he drawled, turning to the shelves behind him. From the back of the store, Martha Gable, the town's primary purveyor of gossip, emerged from behind a stack of flour sacks. Clara, dear, we were so worried about you. That storm was a fright, wasn't it? We heard the wind something fierce, even in town. You must have been terrified, all by your lonesome. Every word was a needle, probing for a weakness. I managed. Martha, Clara said, her eyes fixed on Silas's back. I'm sure you did, Martha cooed, her gaze sweeping over Clara's dress, noting the mud stains, the weariness in her eyes. Still, it's not right. A woman needs a man's protection, especially now. Sheriff says a band of renegade Apache hit a cavalry patrol over by the Verde River 2 nights back, the night the storm started. Terrible business. They say only one of the soldiers survived. Clara's blood turned to ice. She kept her face impassive, but her mind was reeling. The night the storm started, the timing was too perfect. The bullet wound, the knife gashes. She felt a wave of nausea. She wasn't just hiding an Apache, she was hiding a renegade, a killer of soldiers, a man with a price on his head. Silas placed the herbs and a dusty bottle on the counter. That'll be 4 bits. Clara paid, her hands moving with a stiff, deliberate slowness. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. She gathered her things, gave a curt nod, and turned to leave, desperate for the anonymity of the wilderness. As she pushed the door open, a man stepped aside to let her pass. It was Jedediah Thorne, a rancher with a sizable spread north of town. He was a big man with a florid face and small, assessing eyes that had followed her with unwelcome interest since her husband's funeral. Mrs. Miller, he said, his voice overly familiar. He removed his hat, revealing a pate of thinning, sweat-slicked hair. Good to see you made it through the storm. A delicate thing like you, all alone out there. It ain't safe. I'm not delicate, Mr. Thorne, and I'm perfectly safe, she said, stepping around him. A woman can't be too careful, he persisted, his eyes lingering on her. If you ever need a man's help, you know where to find me. The offer was coated in a greasy layer of suggestion that made her skin crawl. She ignored him and walked away, not looking back, but she could feel his gaze on her back, hot and possessive. She untied Beatrice and led the mule out of town, the weight of the town's suspicion a physical burden on her shoulders. Back at the cabin, the silence was absolute, too absolute. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. She pushed the door open, her heart pounding. The main room was empty, just as she'd left it. But the chest she'd placed in front of the larder door had been pushed aside. The door was slightly ajar. No, she breathed. She rushed to the back room and threw the door wide. It was empty. The pile of sacks was bare. He was gone. A wave of something she couldn't name, relief mixed with a sharp, stabbing disappointment, washed over her. He had solved her problem for her. He had left. Then she saw the trail. A few dark, smeared droplets of blood led from the larder, across the main room, and toward the front door. She followed them outside. The trail ended 20 yards from the cabin, near a cluster of boulders. He was there, lying face down in the mud, one arm outstretched as if reaching for the freedom of the forest. He had tried to leave, to spare her the danger of his presence, but his body had betrayed him. He had collapsed, reopening his wounds in the process. For the second time in less than 24 hours, she found herself dragging his dead weight back into her home. This time, however, The fear was mingled with a hot flare of anger. An anger at him, for his stubborn pride, and at herself, for the foolish, inexplicable feeling of panic she'd felt when she thought he was gone. She got him onto her own bed, not caring about the mud or the blood. She stripped off his ruined bandages, her movements efficient and rough. The bullet wound in his shoulder was seeping again, and the long gash in his side looked inflamed. "You fool," she hissed at his unconscious form. "You absolute stubborn fool. Do you want to die?" She worked quickly, cleaning and redressing his wounds with the fresh supplies. As she applied the yarrow poultice to his feverish brow, his eyes fluttered open. They were dark and clouded with pain, but for the first time, they were truly aware. He stared up at her, his gaze intense, searching. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. "Don't talk," she ordered, her voice sharper than she intended. "And don't you dare try to move again. You will lie here until I say you can get up. Do you understand me?" He held her gaze for a long moment, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He closed his eyes, and his breathing evened out, slipping back into a healing sleep. Clara stood over him, her chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a confusing tangle of emotions. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Clara tended to her patient with a detached professionalism, changing his dressings, forcing broth between his lips, monitoring his fever. He remained mostly silent, his eyes following her as she moved about the small cabin. He was a watchful presence, a constant, unnerving reminder of the dangers she had invited into her life. The silence between them was a living thing, filled with unspoken questions and deep, unbreachable divides. One afternoon, about a week after his arrival, she was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in his buckskin leggings. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough from disuse, but it filled the small cabin with startling authority. "Tohan." Clara looked up, startled. "What?" "My name," he said, pushing himself up on one elbow. His brow furrowed with the effort. "It is Tohan." The offering of his name felt momentous, a bridge across the chasm of silence. "Clara," she replied, her voice softer than she'd intended. He nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. He looked at the bandages on his chest, then back at her. "You saved my life." "I'm a nurse," she said quickly, deflecting the gratitude. "It's what I do." "You are not in a hospital," he stated, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her carefully constructed walls. He was right, of course. She fell silent, her needle stilled in her hand. He told her, in short, clipped sentences, that he was of the Chiricahua Apache. He spoke of his village, of a dawn raid by blue-coated soldiers, of fire and smoke and the screams of his people. He didn't speak of it with self-pity, but with a cold, hard rage that was buried so deep it seemed to have become part of his bones. He was a warrior, a survivor of a massacre that had wiped out his family, his entire world. Listening to him, Clara felt the black and white certainty of her world begin to blur into shades of gray. The savage renegade from Martha Gable's gossip was also a man who had lost everything, a man whose scars ran far deeper than the ones she had stitched. The next day, emboldened by his revelation, she finally asked the question that had been haunting her. She was changing the dressing on his shoulder, her fingers brushing against his warm skin, when she found the courage. "Tohan, who shot you?" A shudder came down over his eyes. The openness of the previous day vanished, replaced by a guarded, impenetrable stillness. He looked away from her, his jaw tightening. "The past is a heavy stone," he said, his voice flat. "It is best left unturned." The evasion was as good as a confession. He wasn't just a victim of the cavalry. He had been fighting them. The story from town, the dead soldiers by the Verde River. It all clicked into place with a sickening certainty. He was a wanted man, a killer, and he was living under her roof, sleeping in her bed. The old fear returned, cold and sharp. For the next few days, she was distant, her movements stiff, her words clipped. She was a fool, a naive, sentimental fool who had let her compassion override her common sense. She was harboring a murderer. She thought of Elias, of the senseless violence that had taken him from her. And she looked at Tohan and saw not a patient, but the embodiment of that violence. And yet, when night fell, and the cabin was wrapped in a profound, lonely darkness, she found herself unable to stay away. The fear was real, but so was the crushing weight of her own isolation. After checking on him in the small larder, she would return to the main room, but the silence would press in on her. She would find herself sitting on the stool just outside his closed door, listening to the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing. It was a strange comfort, the simple sound of another human life in the crushing emptiness. His presence, as dangerous as it was, had filled a void in her life she hadn't even realized was there. She was torn between her instinct for self-preservation and a deeper, more treacherous yearning for connection. As Tohan's strength returned, the dynamic in the cabin began to shift. He was no longer a helpless invalid. He began to move around, his large frame seeming to shrink the small space. One morning, Clara woke to the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. She rushed outside to find Tohan by the wood pile, stripped to the waist despite the morning chill, swinging her axe with an easy, powerful grace. A neat stack of firewood was already growing beside him. She opened her mouth to tell him he shouldn't be exerting himself, but the words died on her lips. There was a fierce dignity in his labor, a reclaiming of his strength and purpose. He was not a man who could abide being idle, being a burden. He saw her watching and paused, the axe resting on his shoulder. "The air is cold," he said simply. It was both an explanation and an acknowledgement of her care. After that, he began to help with other chores. The storm had half demolished her chicken coop. One afternoon, she found him methodically rebuilding it, his large, scarred hands surprisingly deft as he fitted the splintered planks back together. He moved with a quiet efficiency, never wasting emotion. He seemed to understand the rhythms of her small homestead without her ever having to speak a word. They existed in a world of shared tasks and comfortable silence. Words were sparse, but a new language was developing between them, a language of gestures and glances. When she brought him a dipper of cool water as he worked, their fingers would brush, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. When she was kneading dough at the table and he was sharpening his knife by the fire, she would sometimes look up to find his eyes on her, his gaze dark and unreadable, and he would hold it for a heartbeat longer than necessary before looking away. These moments were small, fleeting, but they began to weave a delicate, invisible thread between them. She started to see not just the warrior, but the man. She saw the gentleness in the way he handled a frightened chicken, the patience in his hands as he repaired a broken latch. And she realized with a growing sense of panic that her fear of him was slowly being replaced by something far more dangerous, a deep, burgeoning tenderness. But the world outside her small, isolated haven had not forgotten her. The seeds of suspicion planted during her trip to town had taken root. Jedediah Thorne, his pride wounded by her rejection, had taken to riding the perimeter of her property. He told himself he was just keeping an eye on things, but in truth, he was watching her, fueled by a sour mix of desire and resentment. One evening, as dusk was bleeding across the sky, he was hidden in a stand of pines overlooking her cabin. He saw her move past the window, her silhouette clear in the warm lamplight. Then, a moment later, another shadow joined hers. It was taller, broader, a man's shadow. Jedediah's eyes narrowed, a slow, malicious smile spreading across his face. The widow wasn't so lonely after all. A cold, possessive fury ignited in his gut. He had known it, and he knew just what to do with this information. He turned his horse and rode back toward Prescott. the secret a hot, triumphant coal in his chest. The false peace that had settled over the cabin was as thin as new ice over a deep river. For a week, Clara and Tohan had existed in a delicate equilibrium, a world defined by the boundaries of the cabin walls and the quiet rhythm of healing and shared work. The fear had not vanished, but it had retreated to the back of Clara's mind, replaced by a tentative, fragile sense of normalcy. She had begun to sleep through the night again. She had begun to forget that the world outside was a place of judgment and danger. The land, however, had a long memory. She had gone out in the late afternoon to check the snare she kept in the woods, a task that was both a necessity and a welcome escape. The air was crisp, and the sun, low in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows through the trees. When she returned, her small catch of 2 rabbits swinging from her belt, she saw it from a distance, a dark shape, unnaturally still, lying on the weathered planks of her porch. Her first thought was that a deer had wandered down and died, but as she drew closer, the shape resolved itself with sickening clarity. It was a wolf, a great, gray timber wolf, its magnificent coat matted with dirt and dried blood. Its lifeless eyes stared at the sky, and its tongue lolled from a mouth of fearsome teeth. Pinned through its thick neck to the wood of her porch was a crudely fletched arrow, the kind used by local ranchers, not the Apache. It was not a kill from a hunt. It was a message, a trophy, a warning. Clara dropped the rabbits. A cold dread, far colder than the evening air, washed through her, leaving her weak and trembling. She understood the symbolism instantly and viscerally. To the people in town, the Apache were wolves, predators, savages, beasts to be hunted down. By leaving this carcass at her door, they were telling her they knew. We know you are harboring a wild thing. We know you are consorting with the beast. It was a promise of violence, a sign that the fragile peace had been shattered. Her first panicked instinct was to run inside, to bolt the door, to find Tohan, but she stopped herself. She could not let him see this. He would see it not just as a threat to her, but as a challenge to him. His warrior's pride, the deep, cold anger she had glimpsed in him, would ignite. He might do something reckless, something that would get them both killed. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely function, she forced herself to act. She gripped the stiff, cold fur of the wolf, her stomach churning at the contact. It was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Grunting with the effort, she dragged the carcass off the porch and around the side of the cabin, hiding it behind the woodpile. Then, with a bucket of water and a stiff brush, she scrubbed at the dark bloodstain on the planks, her movements frantic, desperate to erase the evidence of the violation. When she finally went inside, the cabin felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. Tohan was sitting by the fire, sharpening the blade of his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing of steel on stone stopped the moment she entered. He looked up, and his dark eyes, so perceptive, so unnervingly intelligent, narrowed. He had not seen the wolf, but he could see the ghost of it in her face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Your spirit is troubled." "It's nothing," she lied, her voice tight and unnatural. She turned away, busying herself with the rabbits, avoiding his gaze. "The wind is turning cold. I think another storm is coming." He said nothing more, but she could feel his eyes on her back, questioning, probing. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It was thick with what she was hiding, with the terror that was now her constant companion. The world was closing in. The discovery of the wolf unlatched something in her, a new, hyper-aware attention to detail. She found herself watching Tohan with a renewed intensity, not as a patient or a companion, but as a puzzle she desperately needed to solve. His scars, which she had once seen as a testament to his survival, now seemed like a dark and unreadable text. She needed to understand the man she was risking her life for. A few days later, the opportunity came in a way she could never have anticipated. He had been helping her re-chink the logs on the western wall of the cabin, a task that required him to work with his shirt off in the warm afternoon sun. His wounds had healed remarkably well. The long gash on his side a puckered red line, the bullet wound on his shoulder a tight, angry knot of flesh. She was handing him a piece of damp clay when her gaze fell upon another scar, one she had overlooked in her initial frantic efforts to save him. It was lower on his torso. On his right side, an old, faded wound, half hidden by the line of his trousers, but it was the shape of it that made the air freeze in her lungs. It was a small, puckered, star-shaped scar, the entry wound of a heavy-caliber rifle slug, a rifle just like the one Elias had owned, a .50 caliber Sharps rifle. He had been so proud of it, of its power and its accuracy. It was the rifle he had been carrying the day he died. The piece of clay fell from her hand, splattering on the ground. The blood drained from her face. The world tilted on its axis. The familiar cabin, the warm sun, the man in front of her, all becoming strange and terrifying. A memory, sharp and brutal, tore through her. The militiamen bringing Elias's body home, the town doctor, old and grim-faced, telling her the skirmish had been chaotic, that men had been lost on both sides. Men on both sides. Could it be? Could this man whose life she had saved, whose quiet presence had become the center of her world, be connected to the death of her husband? The possibility was a physical blow, knocking the breath from her body, leaving her gasping. Tohan turned, his brow furrowed in concern at the sight of her pale, stricken face. "Clara, are you unwell?" She couldn't speak. She could only stare at the scar, the small, damning piece of evidence written on his skin. It was the mark of her husband's rifle. She felt a wave of revulsion so powerful it made her sick. She had touched this man. She had cared for him. She had shared her home with him, and all the while, he carried the mark of her husband's death on his body. I need some water," she stammered, backing away from him as if he were suddenly engulfed in flames. She fled into the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She leaned against the closed door, pressing her hands to her mouth to stifle a sob. The fragile trust she had built, the dangerous tenderness she had begun to feel, crumbled into dust, leaving behind a bitter landscape of hatred, betrayal, and profound confusion. The days that followed were an exercise in cold, silent misery. Clara moved through her chores like an automaton, her face a frozen mask. She could barely bring herself to look at Tohan, let alone speak to him, when she had to tend to the last of his healing wounds. Her touch was clinical, impersonal, her hands trembling with the effort of not recoiling from him. Tohan was not a man to miss such a profound shift. He watched her, his expression unreadable, a deep stillness in his eyes. He stopped trying to speak to her, respecting the wall she had built between them. But his presence was a constant, silent accusation. The cabin, once a shared space, became a battleground of unspoken emotions. The tension finally broke on a night much like the one he had arrived. The sky opened up, and a cold, relentless rain lashed against the cabin, driven by a moaning wind. Sleep was impossible. Clara lay in her bed, staring into the darkness, listening to the storm and the turmoil in her own heart. She heard a floorboard creak. Tohan was awake. Too, she found him sitting by the hearth, where the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers. He was staring into the dying flames, his powerful shoulders slumped, his face a mask of old, deep-seated grief. He looked not like a warrior, but like a man utterly and completely alone in the world. He did not seem to notice her at first. He was lost in a memory, his gaze fixed on a past she could not see. "The rain," he said, his voice quiet, rough with emotion. "It was raining like this the night they came." Clara stood in the shadows, her anger and suspicion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a reluctant pang of sympathy. She knew he was speaking of the raid on his village. "My wife, she was running, carrying our son," he continued, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "The soldiers, their faces were white in the firelight, like ghosts. They cut her down. I saw it. I saw them." He choked on the words, his massive frame shaking with a silent, racking sob. He fell silent, the only sounds the drumming of the rain and the crackle of the embers. The story hung in the air between them, a testament to a loss so profound it dwarfed her own. "They burned everything," he said, his voice regaining its hard, cold edge. "The homes, the winter stores, the sacred places. They left nothing but ashes and bodies. I, and a few other young men, we escaped into the hills. We watched our world burn." He looked up then, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. They burned with a fire that was far hotter than the dying embers. "We did not stay in the hills for long. We went on the hunt. We became the ghosts." He was confessing. He was telling her that he had led a band of warriors on a campaign of vengeance, that he had fought back with the same brutality that had been shown to his people. He was confirming her worst fears. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a raw, trembling whisper. Have you ever killed a white man?" It was the question that lay at the heart of everything, the question that would define them. Tohan held her gaze, his face unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She could hear her own blood roaring in her ears. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but laden with the weight of 1,000 years of conflict. "In a war, Clara, the ground is soaked with the blood of all sides. No one is innocent who survives it." It was not a yes, and it was not a no. It was something far more devastating, the truth. It was a truth that shattered her simple worldview of right and wrong, of victims and villains. He was a killer, but he was also a man who had been grievously wronged, a husband and father avenging the slaughter of his family. And her husband, Elias? He had been a good man, yes, but he had also been part of a militia that had participated in this brutal, endless cycle of violence. He had not been innocent, either. No one was. In that moment, the wall between them didn't just crumble, it was obliterated. She saw him not as an Apache, not as the enemy, but as a man drowning in a grief as deep and as vast as her own. The anger, the hatred, the suspicion, it all washed away on a tidal wave of shared, unbearable pain. Without thinking, she moved. She crossed the space between them and knelt on the hearthrug beside him. He watched her, his expression wary, surprised. She slowly, hesitantly, raised her hand and placed it on his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. She could feel the warmth of his skin. He did not move, did not breathe. She looked from her hand on his chest to his face. His eyes were dark pools of pain and confusion, and a deep, lonely wanting that mirrored her own. Her own eyes filled with tears, blurring his image. And then she leaned in, and he met her halfway. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was a collision, a desperate, clumsy seeking of solace. It was salty with her tears and tasted of wood smoke and rain. It was hesitant at first, a trembling, uncertain exploration. And then it deepened, becoming a raw, hungry expression of all the unspoken loneliness and grief and burgeoning desire that had been simmering between them for weeks. It was a kiss that acknowledged the scars, both visible and invisible, that they both carried. It was a kiss that asked for nothing and offered everything. It was a kiss that broke them both open. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm and ragged against her skin. He framed her face with his large, gentle hands, his thumbs stroking her tear-streaked cheeks. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. That night, by the warm, flickering light of the fire, they shed the last of their defenses. There were no more words. There was only the language of touch, the desperate need to feel another human being close, to chase away the ghosts that haunted the lonely darkness. Their coming together was not an act of love, not yet, but something more primal. It was a frantic search for warmth in a cold world, a fierce, desperate assertion of life in the face of so much death. It was fraught with a beautiful, terrible mixture of fierce desire, profound confusion, and the sweet, sharp sting of guilt. They were two enemies, two survivors, finding a temporary, fragile peace in each other's arms, a small island of solace in a vast ocean of pain. But when the gray light of dawn crept through the window, it brought with it the cold, hard clarity of the morning after. Clara woke first, tangled in the blankets on the floor by the hearth. Tohan's heavy arm still draped protectively over her. In the unforgiving light of day, the magic of the night evaporated, leaving behind a stark and painful reality. Quietly, she slipped from his embrace. She pulled on her dress, her movements stiff, her body aching. She fled the cabin, the scene of her transgression, and took refuge in the familiar, earthy smell of the chicken coop. The hens clucked and muttered around her feet, oblivious to the storm that had broken inside her. She sank onto a bale of hay, buried her face in her hands, and wept. The tears were not for grief, but for a profound and terrifying confusion. What had she done? She had given herself to a man who might have been responsible for her husband's death. She had betrayed Elias's memory. She had betrayed her people, her race, everything she had ever been taught to believe. And the most terrible part of it all was that, in the heart of her guilt and shame, a small, stubborn ember of joy refused to be extinguished. She had not felt so alive, so truly seen, since before Elias had died. She cried for the woman she had been, and for the woman she was afraid she was becoming. The night's intimacy did not survive the dawn. It dissolved in the cold, gray light that crept through the window, leaving behind the hard, undeniable facts of their situation. When Tohan awoke, he found Clara fully dressed, stoking the fire with a rigid, mechanical precision, her back to him. She had not returned to her bed. The space she had occupied beside him on the hearth was now just a cold patch on the floorboards. He rose silently, his movements fluid and noiseless. He watched her for a long moment, taking in the stiff line of her shoulders, the way she refused to look at him. He saw not guilt in her posture, but fear. It was the same fear he had seen in her eyes the first night, but it had a new and terrible dimension. It was no longer just fear of him, but fear for him, and fear of the world that would tear them apart for what they had done. He had seen this kind of fear before, in the eyes of his own people as the soldiers approached. It was the fear of the hunted, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone, that he had brought it into her home. He had been a fool, blinded by his own pain and a need he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. He had found a moment of peace in her arms, a respite from the ghosts that rode with him day and night. But that peace had come at a price, and she was the one who would be forced to pay it. The wolf on the porch had been a warning to her, but for him, it was a declaration. His presence here was a stain, a danger that would eventually consume her. He began to gather his few possessions, the knife she had returned to him, a small leather pouch containing flint and steel, the tattered leggings she had painstakingly mended. He moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose that was more final than any spoken words. Clara turned from the fire, her face pale, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "What are you doing?" Tohan did not look at her. He continued his preparations, his hands steady. "I am leaving." "No," she whispered, the word a raw, desperate plea. She rushed to him, grabbing his arm. The muscle beneath her fingers was hard as oak. "You can't. Your wounds. You're not strong enough." "I am strong enough," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth she had come to know. It was the voice of a warrior making a strategic decision, cutting away all emotion. "But where will you go?" she cried, her voice cracking. They'll be looking for you. The soldiers, the ranchers. They'll hunt you down." "I have been hunted before," he said, finally turning to face her. His expression was a mask of stone, but his eyes held a deep, profound sorrow that mirrored her own. "I will not bring the hunt to your door. Clara, I have brought you enough trouble." "You're not trouble," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes, hot and shameful. "I don't care about the town. I don't care about any of them. Please, Tohan, please don't go." The plea was torn from the deepest part of her, from the lonely, desolate place that Elias's death had carved out. "Don't leave me alone again." Her words struck him like a physical blow. He flinched, his resolve wavering for a fraction of a second. He looked at her, at the tears tracking through the soot on her cheeks, at the desperate hope in her eyes, and he felt his own heart crack. It would be so easy to stay, to lose himself in the fragile sanctuary they had built. But he knew it was an illusion. The wolf had proven that. He gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm. "A lone wolf survives," he said, his voice low and rough. "A wolf that stays with the flock brings the hunters. It is the law of the wild." He turned his back on her, a final, brutal act of dismissal, and slung a small water skin over his shoulder. He was leaving, and there was nothing she could do or say to stop him. While the silent drama played out in Clara's isolated cabin, the gears of a more powerful machine were beginning to turn. At Fort Whipple, the cavalry outpost that served as the fist of the U.S. Army in the territory, Captain Marcus Blackwood was studying a field report. Blackwood was a career soldier, a man who believed in order, discipline, and the manifest destiny of his nation. He was not a cruel man, but he was pragmatic and utterly unsentimental. The Apache were a problem to be managed, an obstacle to civilization, and he managed them with ruthless efficiency. The report detailed the ambush on the Verde River. 3 of his men were dead. 1, a young private named Miller, had survived, albeit with a chest full of broken ribs and a head injury. Blackwood had interviewed the boy himself. The private's account was feverish and disjointed, but one detail stood out, repeated with a kind of terrified awe. "He was a giant, sir," the boy had whispered, his eyes wide. "An Apache, bigger than any I've ever seen. He fought like a demon, took a bullet to the shoulder and didn't even slow down. He's the one who killed the sergeant." A tall Apache, a survivor. The description niggled at Blackwood. It matched the intelligence he'd received after the raid on the Chiricahua village months earlier. Whispers of a new war leader, a man called Tohan, who had survived the massacre and was now gathering the scattered remnants of his people, leading them on a campaign of bloody revenge. If this was the same man, he was not just a renegade. He was a leader, a symbol. Capturing him would be a significant victory, a blow to the heart of the Apache resistance. "Send a patrol back to the ambush site," he ordered his lieutenant. "I want a full sweep of the area. He was wounded. He can't have gone far. Check every homestead, every ranch. Someone may have seen him. Someone may be helping him." The net was being cast. It was Jedediah Thorne who brought the net directly to Clara's door. He rode into Fort Whipple 2 days later, his face a mask of civic duty that barely concealed the vindictive glee in his eyes. He demanded to see the captain, claiming he had information of a vital nature. He was shown into Blackwood's office. The captain listened, his face impassive, as Thorne, with a great show of reluctance, spun his tale. He spoke of the reclusive widow, Clara Miller, and his own neighborly concern for her safety. He mentioned seeing smoke from her chimney at odd hours, of hearing sounds from the cabin when he knew she should be alone, and then the final, damning piece of evidence. "I saw a shadow in her window, Captain," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A man's shadow, a big man, and with the news of that renegade on the loose, well, I felt it was my duty to report it. She's a lonely woman. Grief can do strange things to a person's mind, make them foolish." Blackwood studied the rancher for a long moment. He recognized the man's type instantly. The petty tyrant, the spurned suitor. Thorne's motives were as transparent as glass, and just as ugly. But the information, regardless of its source, was too compelling to ignore. The widow's cabin was isolated, located on the very edge of Apache territory. It was the perfect place for a wounded man to hide. "You believe she is harboring this fugitive?" Blackwood asked, his voice sharp. "I believe she is in danger," Thorne corrected smoothly. "Or that she has forgotten her loyalties. Either way, for her own good, her cabin should be searched." He leaned forward, his voice dropping further. "If you resolve the situation, Captain, a man like me can be very useful. Keeping an eye on things, ensuring the town remains patriotic. A little official recognition of my service would go a long way." The offer of becoming a paid informant, a town spy, hung in the air. Blackwood felt a flicker of distaste. He had a war to fight. He had no time for the petty, sordid dramas of these civilians. But Thorne's information was a key. "Your patriotism is noted, Mr. Thorne," Blackwood said, his voice dismissing the rancher. "I will look into the matter." That night, a squad of 6 cavalrymen, their faces grim in the moonlight, rode out from Fort Whipple. They moved silently, their saddle leather creaking softly, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp earth. Their destination was a small, lonely cabin at the foot of a stony mesa. Inside that cabin, the final, silent argument between Clara and Tohan had reached its conclusion. He was ready to go. He stood by the door, a phantom in the moonlight filtering through the window. Clara stood by the hearth, her arms wrapped around herself, a portrait of silent, helpless misery. He turned to her, and for a moment, the warrior's mask slipped. She saw in his eyes the memory of the night they had shared, the ghost of a tenderness that had been born in the storm. "They will come for me," he said, his voice a low whisper. "When they do, you know nothing. You saw nothing. I was never here. Swear it." "I can't," she sobbed. "You must," he insisted, his voice hardening again. He moved quickly to her, grabbing her shoulders. His grip was firm, urgent. "Your life depends on it. Swear it, Clara." She looked into his eyes, saw the fierce, desperate plea there, and finally gave a shuddering nod. I swear." He released her and moved to the back wall of the cabin. He pointed to a section of loose stones in the foundation, hidden behind a stack of firewood. "Behind these rocks, there is a fissure. It leads to a small cave in the hillside. It is dry. It is hidden. That is where I will be. I will watch. I will not be far." He was not just leaving her. He was giving her a piece of himself, a secret location, a promise that he would still be a presence in her life, even if unseen. Before she could respond, his head snapped up, his body going tense. He had heard it before she did, a faint, rhythmic sound carried on the night air, the sound of approaching horses. There was no time for goodbyes, no time for another touch. "Remember," he hissed, and then he was gone, slipping out the back door and melting into the darkness like a ghost. Clara stood, frozen in terror, for a heartbeat. Then she flew into action. She kicked the blankets on the hearth into disarray, grabbed a half-empty bottle of whiskey from the shelf and set it on the table. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall in a messy tangle around her shoulders. She had to play the part of the grieving, half-mad widow. She didn't have to wait long. A heavy fist hammered on the door, so hard the whole cabin shook. "Open up, U.S. Cavalry!" She stumbled to the door and fumbled with the bolt, her hands shaking. When she pulled it open, she was met with the sight of 6 grim-faced soldiers, their uniforms dark blue in the moonlight, rifles held at the ready. A young lieutenant with a nervous face stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Harris. We have reason to believe you are harboring a fugitive. We need to search your home." They didn't wait for her permission. They pushed past her, their boots muddying her clean floor. The cabin, her sanctuary, was instantly filled with their hostile, masculine presence. They were methodical, efficient, and utterly ruthless. They overturned her bed, ripped the stuffing from her mattress. They smashed the jars of preserves she had so carefully stored, their contents bleeding onto the floor. They threw her books, her clothes, her few possessions into a heap in the center of the room. One of them picked up the small, framed photograph of Elias and studied it for a moment before tossing it carelessly onto the pile. Clara watched, a silent, trembling witness to the violation of her life. She said nothing, did nothing. She held Tohan's final command in her mind like a prayer. "You know nothing?" They found no one. The larder was empty save for sacks of flour. The small loft held only dust and spiders. The lieutenant approached her, his face a mixture of frustration and suspicion. "Where is he, ma'am?" "Where is who?" Clara asked, her voice a convincing imitation of a drunkard's slur. She gestured to the whiskey bottle. "I'm alone, always alone." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. He looked around the trashed cabin, at the single bed, the one chair, but there was a second cup on the table. Still damp, there was a faint, lingering smell of wood smoke and an unfamiliar, musky scent that was not hers. "You're under arrest, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice hard, "on suspicion of aiding and abetting an enemy of the United States Army." They dragged her from the ruins of her home and tied her hands. As they led her out into the moonlight, she saw the faces. It seemed the entire town of Prescott had followed the soldiers, drawn by the promise of a spectacle. They stood in a silent, jeering mob, their faces pale and judgmental in the torchlight. Jedediah Thorne was at the front, a triumphant smirk on his face. "There she is!" Martha Gable shrieked, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "The Apache's woman!" The insult struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Other voices joined in, a chorus of hatred. "Traitor! Disgraced widow! She dishonors her dead husband!" They forced her to walk through the gauntlet of their scorn. She kept her head held high, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the torchlight. But inside, she was crumbling. They put her on a horse and led her away, leaving her burning cabin to the mercy of the night. They didn't take her to the jail. They locked her in an old, abandoned grain warehouse on the edge of town. The lieutenant shoved her inside and slammed the heavy door, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the cavernous space. She was left in total darkness, with only the smell of old dust and decay for company. Clara sank to the dirt floor, the last of her strength deserting her. Sobs racked her body, dry, painful heaves that brought no relief. She had lost everything, her home, her reputation, her freedom. She was alone, truly and utterly alone, in a darkness that was as complete as the one in her own soul. But even as she wept, a hard, stubborn core of defiance remained. They could take everything from her, but they could not make her speak. She would not betray him. Sometime later, hours or an eternity, she heard a sound, a faint scratching at the high barred window at the back of the warehouse. She looked up, her heart stopping. A face appeared in the small rectangle of moonlight. It was Tohan. He had followed them. He had watched everything. His face was a mask of anguish, his eyes burning with a pain and fury that was terrifying to behold. He pressed his face against the bars, his fingers gripping the cold iron. He whispered her name, a sound that was more a breath of air than a word. "Clara!" She scrambled to her feet and rushed to the window, climbing onto a stack of old crates to reach it. They were separated by the bars, by a world of hatred and violence. But for a few stolen seconds, they were together. No words were needed. Their eyes spoke a language of shared tragedy, of impossible love, of a future that had been stolen from them. Tears streamed down both their faces. She reached out, her fingers just managing to touch his through the bars. His skin was cold. Then he was gone. He melted back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. A moment later, she heard the faint sound of a sentry's call, and she knew he had risked his life for just a few moments at her window. She stared at the empty space where he had been, her heart aching with a pain that was almost unbearable. Then she saw it. On the dusty wooden frame of the window, there was a mark, a perfect, bloody handprint, left where he had braced himself, and hanging from a nail just below it was a small, smooth river stone, etched with a symbol like a spiraling wind, tied with a leather thong. It was an Apache charm, a piece of his soul. He had left her a promise, a sign that he was still out there, watching over her. Clara reached out and carefully took the charm, clutching it in her hand. It was still warm from his body, in the cold, suffocating darkness of her prison. It was the only warmth she had left. The bloody handprint on the window frame was a brand on Tohan's soul. As he melted back into the shadows of Prescott, the image of Clara's face, pale and tear-streaked behind the iron bars, was seared into his mind. He had fled from her cabin to protect her, and in doing so, had led the hunters right to her door. The guilt was a physical thing, a poison in his blood, hotter and more potent than any fever. His rage was a cold, silent thing, directed not at the soldiers who were merely dogs following a scent, but at himself. He moved through the night like a phantom, a ghost in his own land. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, was a potential enemy. He avoided the trails, keeping to the high ridges and deep arroyos, his moccasins making no sound on the stony ground. He had a destination, a desperate, fading hope, a hidden canyon deep in the Dragoon Mountains where the last of his people, the survivors of the massacre, had taken refuge. He needed warriors. He needed help to storm the town, to tear down the walls of Clara's prison and carry her away. The plan was madness, a suicide mission, but it was the only plan he had. The journey took 3 days. He traveled without fire, eating dried jerky from his pouch and drinking from cold mountain streams. He slept in short, fitful bursts, haunted by visions of Clara's face. He was not just a warrior seeking aid. He was a penitent on a pilgrimage of atonement. The stone she had clutched, a piece of his spirit, felt like a lead weight in his heart. He had given her a promise of protection and had failed utterly. When he finally reached the hidden canyon, the sight that greeted him extinguished the last ember of his hope. He had expected to find a war camp, a place of grim resolve, of warriors sharpening their lances and planning their revenge. He had expected to find the remnants of the Chiricahua nation, battered but not broken. Instead, he found a place of ghosts. The small encampment was huddled in the canyon's shadow, a collection of makeshift wickiups that seemed to crouch against the rock, as if in fear. There were no young men, no proud warriors. There were only the very old and the very young. Gaunt-faced women moved with a weary slowness, their eyes holding a permanent, hollowed-out grief. Children, their bellies swollen from hunger, played listless games in the dust. The elders sat wrapped in thin blankets, their faces like cracked leather, their gazes turned inward, lost in the memories of a world that was gone. This was not a war camp. It was a refugee camp. It was the final, fading heartbeat of a dying people. An old woman, whose name was Skywatcher, saw him first. Her eyes, though clouded with age, were still sharp. She had been his mother's friend, a medicine woman of great power in the before times. "Tohan," she rasped, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You have returned. We thought the soldiers had taken your spirit." "They have taken my will to live, but not my spirit," he answered, his own voice sounding hollow in the quiet canyon. He looked around at the desolate scene. "Where are the others? Where are the warriors? Kale, Hintu, One Eye?" The old woman's face crumpled. "Gone," she whispered. "Some were taken in the raid. Others rode out to seek a warrior's death and found it. You are the last of the young men, Tohan, the last of the war leaders." The words were a death knell. He had come seeking an army and had found a graveyard. There would be no rescue. There would be no storming of the town. There was only him. He spent the rest of the day in a state of numb despair. He shared his jerky with the children and listened to the elders' tales of woe. They spoke of sickness, of starvation, of the constant fear of discovery. They were a people holding on by a thread, and to ask them to fight, to risk what little they had for a white woman, was an impossibility. It would be asking them to commit collective suicide. That night, he sat with the old chief, Gray Elk, a man whose body was now frail and bent, but whose mind was still a repository of their people's wisdom. "I have come for help," Tohan said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "There is a woman, a white woman. She saved my life. Now the soldiers have taken her because of me. I must get her back." Gray Elk stared into the small, smokeless fire for a long time before he spoke. "The debt you owe this woman is a heavy one. A life for a life. It is the law of honor. But you are more than one man. Tohan, you are the future. You are the seed from which a new tree might grow. If your life is thrown away for this woman, then the seed is scattered to the wind, and the tree will never be. The people need you. You must let her go. Survive. Find a new wife from among the other scattered bands. Have children. Keep our ways alive. That is your duty now." The chief's words were wise. They were logical. They were the words of a leader responsible for the survival of his tribe, and every word was a knife in Tohan's heart. He left the camp before dawn. He climbed to the highest point of the canyon rim, a wind-swept promontory that offered a view of the entire territory, a vast, indifferent landscape stretching to the horizon. The rising sun painted the clouds in hues of blood and fire. He stood there, alone between the earth and the sky, and faced the choice that would define the rest of his life. He could obey his chief. He could accept the bitter logic of survival. He could ride north, into the wildlands where the army's reach was weak. He could find other survivors, live the life of a wanderer, a ghost, forever hunted, forever looking back. He could fulfill his duty to a future that seemed as insubstantial as a dream. It was the path of reason. Or he could follow the path of his heart. He could return to Prescott. He could face the soldiers, face certain death. For the woman who had shown him a kindness he thought had vanished from the world. He thought of her face, of her touch, of the fierce, stubborn compassion that had made her drag a bleeding enemy into her home. He thought of the night they had shared, a moment of impossible connection in a world determined to keep them apart. He owed her a debt. Yes, but it was more than that now. In that small, isolated cabin, she had stitched together not just his wounds, but the shattered pieces of his humanity. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a warrior, calloused and scarred, made for killing, but she had made them remember how to be gentle. He looked out at the land. It was his home, his birthright, but it was a home that had been stolen from him. The battle for the land was lost. The war for his people was over. Gray Elk was right. His duty was to survive. But the chief was also wrong. Survival without honor was not life. It was a slow death. And his honor, the very core of his being, was now tied to the fate of the woman in the warehouse. His choice was made. It was not a choice of the head, but of the soul. He was no longer a war leader with a duty to his people. He was just a man, with a duty to one woman. He turned his back on the north and began the long journey back to Prescott. While Tohan wrestled with his conscience, Clara was fighting her own battle. For 3 days, she had been kept in the stifling darkness of the warehouse, twice a day. A sullen soldier would slide a tin plate of stale bread and a cup of lukewarm water through a slot in the door. The isolation was a form of torture, designed to break her spirit, but they had misjudged her. She was no stranger to isolation. She had lived with it for 2 years, and now she was not truly alone. She had the memory of Tohan's face at the window, and she had the small, smooth stone he had left her. She held it constantly. its coolness a comfort in her palm, its weight a reminder that she was not forgotten. On the fourth day, they came for her. They dragged her out into the blinding sunlight, her eyes aching at the sudden brightness. They marched her down the main street of Prescott to the saloon. The entire town had turned out for the spectacle. They lined the street, their faces a gallery of contempt, pity, and morbid curiosity. The saloon had been converted into a makeshift courtroom. Captain Blackwood sat at a poker table, a gavel in his hand, his face set in a stern, impartial mask that fooled no one. A group of grim-faced ranchers and merchants sat beside him, a jury of the prejudiced. Jedediah Thorne was there, preening in his new role as the town's righteous informant. The trial was a farce. There was no real evidence, only innuendo and suspicion. Thorne testified to seeing the man's shadow. Mr. Abernathy testified that she had bought whiskey for medicinal purposes, his tone heavy with sarcasm. Martha Gable testified to Clara's unnatural reclusiveness and her lack of proper grief. Through it all, Clara stood tall and silent. When Blackwood questioned her directly, his voice sharp and menacing, she met his gaze and said nothing. Mrs. Miller, did you or did you not give aid and comfort to a hostile Apache warrior, the man known as Tohan? He demanded. Silence. Did you harbor him in your home, knowing he was responsible for the deaths of United States soldiers? Silence. Your silence condemns you. Madam, I will ask you one last time. Where is he? Clara's eyes flickered for a moment to the faces in the crowd, to the hatred and the fear. And then she thought of Tohan, of his quiet dignity, of his pain. She would rather die than betray him. She remained silent. Blackwood slammed the gavel down. In the absence of any cooperation, and in light of the testimony given, this military tribunal finds you, Clara Miller, guilty of consorting with the enemy. Your homestead and property are hereby forfeit to the territorial government. You will be held in custody until such time as you can be transported to the federal prison at Yuma. He paused, his cold eyes sweeping over her. Let this be a lesson to any who would place their sympathies with savages over their own kind. A wave of murmurs and self-righteous approval swept through the crowd. Clara felt a dizzying sense of despair. Yuma, it was a death sentence. But before she could fully process it, before the soldiers could lay hands on her, a new sound cut through the noise of the crowd. It was the sound of a single horse, approaching at a slow, deliberate, almost regal pace. It was a sound that did not belong in the chaotic, muddy street of Prescott. Heads turned. The crowd by the saloon doors parted, their jeers and whispers dying on their lips, replaced by gasps of shock and fear. He appeared in the doorway, framed against the bright sunlight. A figure from a nightmare. It was Tohan, but it was not the Tohan she had known. The quiet, wounded man who had rebuilt her chicken coop. This was Tohan the warrior, Tohan the ghost, Tohan the living embodiment of their deepest fears. He was mounted on a fiery pinto pony, sitting straight and proud on a simple blanket saddle. He was stripped to the waist, his skin gleaming, his torso and face painted for war in stark patterns of black and white. A single eagle feather was tied in his long black hair. In one hand, he held a long, stone-tipped lance. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. And he was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. The saloon erupted into chaos. Women screamed. Men scrambled for cover, overturning tables and chairs. The soldiers raised their rifles, their knuckles white, their face pale with shock. Only Captain Blackwood remained seated, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of grudging respect in his gaze. Tohan paid them no mind. He urged his horse forward, into the center of the room, the animal's hooves clattering on the wooden floor. He did not look at the soldiers. He did not look at the cowering townsfolk. His eyes found Clara, and they held her, a silent, desperate communication passing between them. He had not come to fight. He had come to surrender. He looked from Clara to Captain Blackwood, his expression calm, his voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority that commanded attention. "I am the man you seek," he said. He raised his hand, the one that had left its bloody print on her window, and pointed to his own chest. "I am Tohan. I will go with you." He paused, his gaze shifting back to Clara, his expression softening for just a fraction of a second. "Let her go." The room was utterly silent. The sheer audacity of the act, the raw courage of it, stunned everyone. Clara understood instantly. This was his final gift to her, his final act of protection. He was trading his life for hers. "No!" The scream was torn from her throat, a raw, animal sound of pure agony. She lunged forward, fighting against the guards who grabbed her arms. "No, Tohan, don't do this, please!" But he was no longer looking at her. He was looking at Blackwood, a silent challenge passing between the two men. Blackwood, for his part, was a soldier. He saw not a man, but a strategic objective, willingly placing itself in his hands. "Release the woman," Blackwood commanded, his voice tight. Tohan watched as the soldiers let go of Clara's arms. He watched as she stumbled, her face a mask of utter devastation. And then he turned his gaze to her one last time. A small, sad, infinitely gentle smile touched his lips. It was a smile that broke her heart into a million pieces. "At least," he said, his voice so quiet only she could have heard it, "you will live." With that, he let the lance slip from his fingers. It clattered to the floor, in a single, fluid motion. He swung his leg over his horse and dropped lightly to the ground. He stood before them, proud, unbowed, and held out his hands to be tied. The soldiers, their fear replaced by a brutal efficiency, swarmed him, binding his wrists tightly behind his back. They pushed him toward the door, shoving him roughly. He did not resist. He walked with his head held high, his back straight. Clara watched him go, her entire world narrowing to the sight of his retreating form. The last thing she saw was the proud set of his shoulders as he disappeared through the doorway into the blinding sun. And then, the world dissolved into a roaring blackness. The floorboards rushed up to meet her, and she knew no more. Clara awoke to the smell of stale beer and sawdust. The roaring in her ears resolved itself into the jeering laughter of the townsfolk as two soldiers roughly pulled her to her feet. The world was a dizzying, tilted thing. She had been released, as Tohan had bargained. But her freedom was a prison more profound than the warehouse. They cast her out of the saloon into the muddy street, a pariah, the woman who had traded her honor for a savage. No one would speak to her. No one would meet her eye. She was a ghost in her own life. They did not let her return to her cabin. It was now the property of the territory. She was given a small, drafty room at the back of the boarding house, the cost of which was to be worked off by doing the laundry and scrubbing the floors, tasks usually reserved for the most destitute. It was a public shaming, a daily humiliation, but Clara endured it. She scrubbed and washed and mended, her body moving on autopilot, while her mind, her entire being, was focused on one thing: Tohan. He was being held at Fort Whipple, in the stone stockade reserved for the most dangerous prisoners. The town buzzed with the news of his impending fate. Captain Blackwood, flush with his victory, had sent for a circuit judge. There would be a trial, a swift one, and then a hanging. It was to be a grand spectacle, a demonstration of the power of the law and the inevitability of order. They were planning to hang him in the center of town in 10 days' time. 10 days. The words were a death sentence, a countdown that echoed with every beat of Clara's heart. She tried every legitimate means she could conceive. She walked the 2 miles to the fort and stood at the gates, begging the sentries to let her see the captain. They laughed and turned her away. She wrote a letter, her hands shaking, pleading for mercy. For a moment to speak to the prisoner, The letter was never answered. She approached the town preacher, a man whose sermons were filled with fire and brimstone, hoping for a flicker of Christian charity. He looked at her with cold, unforgiving eyes and told her to pray for her own fallen soul and leave the fate of the heathen to God and the U.S. Army. Every door was slammed in her face. Every avenue was a dead end. The world had condemned him, and by extension, it had condemned her. As the days bled into one another, a cold, hard resolve began to form in the pit of her stomach. If the world would not grant her justice or mercy, she would have to steal it for herself. The quiet, grieving widow was gone, burned away in the fire of her public disgrace. In her place was a woman with nothing left to lose. On the 8th day, she began to plan. She worked her chores with a feverish energy, hoarding scraps of food, a piece of bread here, a strip of dried meat there. Her mind, once occupied with the rhythms of the seasons and the needs of her small homestead, was now a map of Fort Whipple. She had only seen it from the outside, but she forced herself to remember every detail: the placement of the guard towers, the timing of the patrols she had observed, the location of the stables and the supply depot. On the 9th night, the night before the judge was due to arrive, she made her move, dressed in dark, rough-spun clothes, her hair tucked under a cap. She slipped out of the boarding house and into the moonless dark. She moved through the sleeping town like a wraith, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The fort was a dark, slumbering beast. She circled it for what felt like an eternity, her nerves screaming, waiting for the moment the guards changed shifts. When the opportunity came, a brief window of inattention, she scaled the rough log palisade at a spot near the back, where the shadows were deepest. She dropped silently to the ground inside, landing with a soft thud that sounded deafeningly loud in the stillness. She found the stockade easily, a squat, windowless stone building in the center of the parade ground. It was a place of absolute despair. 2 guards stood at the heavy oak door, their rifles held loosely, their conversation a low murmur. There was no way to get past them. Clara crept around to the side of the building. There was a small, high slit in the stone, barely wide enough for a hand to pass through, designed for ventilation, not viewing. She pressed herself against the cold, damp stone and listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, a faint sound from within, the sound of a man breathing, slow and steady. "Tohan," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. The breathing stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then, a dark shape blotted out the faint starlight from the slit. She saw the outline of his face, the gleam of an eye. "Clara!" His voice came, a low rumble, filled with disbelief and a fierce, protective anger. "You should not be here. It is too dangerous." "I couldn't. I had to see you," she choked, pressing her face against the rough stone. "Go," he commanded, his voice urgent. "Go now, before you are seen." "They're going to kill you," she sobbed, the words she had held back for days finally breaking free. "It is a warrior's death," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. There was only a profound, bottomless sadness. "I traded my life for yours. It was a good trade." "No," she whispered. "It wasn't." She reached up, her fingers finding the slit. He met her touch from the other side. They could not see each other fully, could not hold each other, but their fingers intertwined through the cold stone, a desperate, fleeting connection in the darkness. They said nothing more. There were no words for this kind of grief, for this kind of love. They simply held on, their hands a bridge across an impossible divide, their silent communion a final, heartbreaking farewell. A guard's cough from the front of the building broke the spell. With a final, desperate squeeze of his fingers, he was gone from the opening. Clara stumbled back into the shadows, her heart shattered. Her retreat from the fort was a blur of terror. She made it back to her room undetected, but not unscathed. The touch of his hand, The finality in his voice had changed her. The desperate plan that had been forming in her mind now solidified into a certainty. She would not let him die. If he had traded his life for hers, she would steal it back. The final night was a maelstrom of wind and rain, a storm that seemed to mirror the one in her soul. It was a gift from the heavens, a cloak for her desperate gamble. Just before midnight, she slipped out of the boarding house for the last time. In her hands, she carried a small can of kerosene she had siphoned from the boarding house lamps. Her target was the fort's quartermaster's store, a large wooden building filled with grain, hay, and barrels of salted meat. It was located near the stables, at the far end of the fort from the stockade. She prayed the old stories she'd heard from drunken soldiers were true. She breached the walls at the same spot as before. The wind and rain covered her movements. The sentries huddled in their watchtowers, their heads bowed against the deluge. She reached the storehouse, her hands trembling as she pried open a shutter. She poured the kerosene onto a pile of dry hay just inside, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She struck a match. The flame flickered, then caught. A small, hungry tongue of orange fire licked at the hay. She did not wait to watch it grow. She fled, circling back toward the stables. It took less than a minute. A shout rang out, then another. The flames, fed by the dry fodder and the wind, exploded through the roof of the storehouse, painting the rain-swept sky in a horrifying palette of orange and red. The fort's alarm bell began to clang, a frantic, chaotic sound. Soldiers poured from the barracks, their shouts lost in the roar of the fire and the storm. The entire garrison's attention was focused on the inferno, on saving the stables and preventing the fire from spreading. It was the chaos she had prayed for. She found the small, hidden door at the back of the stables, half overgrown with weeds. The story was true. An old root cellar, dug out a generation ago, connected the stables to a small, caved-in opening just outside the fort's walls. It had been used for smuggling whiskey. The old soldiers had boasted. Tonight, it would be used for smuggling a life. The tunnel was dark, claustrophobic, and smelled of damp earth and decay. She navigated it by touch, her hands scraping against the rough dirt walls. The stable end was blocked by a heavy stone slab. It took all of her strength to move it. She emerged into the chaos of the stables, the air thick with the smoke from the nearby fire and the panicked whinnying of horses. The stockade was now guarded by a single, distracted soldier, his attention fixed on the fire. Tohan was waiting. He had heard the commotion, had understood its meaning. He had used a loose stone from his cell wall to hammer at the lock on his door until it was weakened. The rest was a blur of frantic, desperate action. Clara dispatched the lone guard with a heavy iron skillet she'd found in the stable. The blow was clumsy but effective. She worked on the damaged lock with a crowbar, her muscles screaming. The lock gave way. The door swung open. Tohan emerged from the darkness, his eyes blazing with a fierce, wild light. There was no time for words. He grabbed her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her, and they plunged into the tunnel. They burst out of the far end into the teeth of the storm. Free! The rain washed the grime and despair from their faces. They ran, hand in hand, into the shelter of the forest, the shouts and the clanging bell of the fort fading behind them. They scrambled up the slick, muddy slopes of the mountains that bordered the town, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and their pursuers. They did not stop until the first pale light of dawn broke through the clouds, and the sounds of the hunt were lost to the wind. They journeyed for weeks, moving like ghosts through a land that was no longer safe for either of them. They traveled through the borderlands, the lawless, unclaimed territories between the settled lands of the whites and the last, scattered strongholds of the Apache. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, but it was theirs. In a hidden valley, sheltered by sheer canyon walls and fed by a clear, cold spring, they finally stopped. There, they built a new life, a life stripped down to its barest essentials. They constructed a small, sturdy hogan from mud and branches, a shelter that was more a part of the earth than an imposition upon it. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs of the land. She taught him more English, and he taught her the words in his own tongue for the sun, the moon, the hawk that circled their valley. Their life was simple, impoverished by the standards of the world they had left behind. But it was a life of profound and quiet richness. There were no more secrets, no more divisions. The ghosts of their pasts still walked with them, but they were no longer overwhelming. In the shared warmth of their small fire, in the quiet companionship of their days, they found a healing that neither had thought possible. One evening, as they sat watching the stars emerge in the clear, cold desert sky, Clara felt a strange, fluttering movement inside her. She went still, her breath catching in her throat. She took Tohan's hand and placed it on her belly. He looked at her, his expression questioning, and then he felt it too. His eyes widened, first in shock, and then with a slow, dawning wonder that was more beautiful than any sunrise. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with an infinite, tender reverence, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He pressed his forehead to hers, and in the starlight, she could see the tears gleaming in his eyes. She smiled, a true, deep smile of pure joy. She leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She was home, this wild, untamed place, this man who was her enemy and her savior, this new life stirring within her. This was her home. "Now I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You brought me where I belong." But peace, in that brutal and unforgiving land, was a fleeting and fragile thing. Their sanctuary was discovered by a cavalry patrol, a fluke, a chance sighting of the smoke from their fire. The world they had escaped had found them again. The chase began at dawn. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the morning stillness. They fled, Tohan half carrying, half guiding her up the steep canyon walls. They were exposed, outnumbered, in the desperate scramble up a rock-strewn slope. Clara's foot slipped. She fell, her leg twisting beneath her, a sharp, searing pain shooting up to her hip. She cried out, more in frustration than in pain. She could not run. Tohan did not hesitate. The soldiers were closing in, their blue uniforms stark against the red rock. Bullets whined past them, chipping stone from the cliff face. He swept her up into his arms, his powerful muscles straining, and began to run again, carrying her as if she weighed nothing. He was a magnificent target, a giant of a man moving across the open ground. A volley of shots rang out. He staggered, a grunt of pain torn from his chest. Clara felt a sudden, hot wetness spreading across her back, soaking her dress. It was his blood. He had been hit. "Tohan, no!" she screamed, struggling in his arms. "Put me down! Save yourself!" He ignored her, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the ridge above them, the gateway to the high country, to safety. He kept running, his long legs eating up the ground, his own lifeblood draining away with every step. Another bullet struck him, this time in the side. He stumbled again but did not fall. He was a force of nature, a being of pure, indomitable will, driven by a love that was stronger than death itself. He would not let her go. He would not let them be taken. He carried her over the ridge, out of the line of fire, and did not stop until he collapsed in a high, sun-drenched meadow, hidden from the world below. The sun was warm on her face when Clara awoke. The air was clean and sharp, filled with the scent of pine and wild sage. For a moment, she felt a sense of profound peace. Then, the memory of the chase, of the gunfire, of Tohan's blood, crashed down on her. She sat up, her heart seizing with a cold, terrible dread. She was alone. Beside her, in the soft earth of the meadow, was a small, freshly made grave, a simple mound of stones topped with a single eagle feather. He had done it. He had carried her to safety. He had used the last of his incredible strength to dig a shallow grave for himself, to protect his body from the scavengers of the wild. He had saved her and their child, but he had not been able to save himself. She crawled to the mound of stones, her body shaking with a grief so immense it had no sound. She laid her hand on the grave, the rocks still holding a faint warmth from the sun. The world was silent, beautiful, and utterly empty. She had found where she belonged, only to lose it. She stayed there for a long time, until the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in the colors of a fresh bruise. Finally, slowly, she got to her feet. She stood in the heart of the wild, untamed land that had taken everything from her and given her everything. She placed a hand on her belly, on the small, precious life that was the last, enduring piece of him. She looked out at the vast, empty horizon, tears streaming down her face, but in her eyes, mixed with the unbearable pain, was a tiny, fierce, and unquenchable spark of light, a flicker of hope. Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel and sharing your thoughts.